So this is going to be a thought catalogue of a few ideas that are loosely connected. The biggest chunk of this, I guess, is how black elites have sort of poisoned ideology. They have overturned liberalism. Well, obviously not all black elites, but black elite imposters have this perverse incentive to take their revenge against meritocracy and produce a kind of communistic ideology, or a kind of cultural Marxist ideology, to cover up for all the benefits that affirmative action has granted black elites. So there's this horrible incentive to sort of, what's the word that they use in the mob when they clean money? Launder. To sort of ideologically launder their own ill-gotten gains. So I take that to be the great engine that has destroyed a lot of things in this society, talking as a South African. But one of the ways in which this happens, because this happens in more than one way, is that when you have race-based policy that targets benefits to people based solely on their race, you completely overlook the actual problem of how do you uplift people at the bottom of society, which is a real problem that has to be addressed, but it never becomes addressed because you're focused on trying to equalize something like racialist pride within society or something. You've got some grand racialist experiment that you're conducting. And then black elites are always the first to complain that these policies don't trickle down to the bottom of society, that you need some more radical global, when I say global, I don't mean worldly, I mean just more extreme version of the same policy, or the same policy needs to be applied further, or it needs to be applied in a cultural dimension in order to cover over itself. Or cleanse itself of its own sort of internal bias, which is essentially to give benefits to elites. Because, I mean, that's what's going to happen if you have race-based targets. If your policy is using race as its target, it can never be an intelligent policy. And if you don't apply intelligent policy to society, you don't get very good outcomes. Instead, you get benefits accruing to the very top of society, people that were one step away from, having a very good life in any case. So it never fixes the problem and then you also have to justify that form of targeting people, so then you have to come up with this racialist lie that somehow capitalism is entrenched in white supremacy or some racialist garbage like that, and it all kind of resolves itself to be a kind of ethno-nationalism. So that's what we're kind of living through. Unintelligent policy, that then the weight of that unintelligent policy creates a whole lot of bunk ideology. Another side product of this is just that morality itself is then missing from policy. Because if you can't have an intelligent policy, you're not going to be able to meet the high standards of that which can only be achieved by intelligent policy. You can't take certain things into account. And then what I should also add is that the general problem that our society faces in terms of its failure of gatekeeping, I would say, started with affirmative action. This ideology that creates sympathy targets that have nebulous impacts from historically inherited sources attached to them. This vague morality that is always demanding sympathy be given out to a kind of lowest common denominator is a strange danger to society which is made up of individuals. Policy that only works by targeting groups. You can't see the wood for the trees. You can't address a member of a group when that's how they're being targeted as a member of that group. I mean, this is why ameliorative actions taken to uplift people should always be class-based, because that's a kind of innocuous group, if you even want to call it a group. It's I would argue that it's not really a group, it's a class. A classification in a set of categories that by definition mean you're going to have limited opportunity, and then in the individualistic lens through no fault of your own. So you can focus trying to extend equality of opportunity towards people of lower class. But yeah, let me delve into their argument, their emotional argument, that they have a kind of inherited impact that then requires that a group be perpetually patronized based on its lowest member that can't overcome something or that feels aggrieved. Now, the problem here is that there's no quantification, but I think that the fact that there's no quantification as to how things have been impacted, so you can't actually have a just reparation. You can only have a symbolic reparation at that point. So both of these things, I think, are warning signs that there's something funny about this framework. This conceptual framework is going to lead you down a dark path. When you want something that you can't you want something for something that can't be quantified, but is symbolically necessary, based on the logic that you are a member of that group. So you get into the sympathy, you get into the patronizing, and somehow that has to be codified into some ideology that is kosher somehow. And I guess the biggest problem that these sorts of things pose is that if they force you to have policy that targets based on race, you can't have intelligent policy, and you also have a giant impediment to non-racialist consciousness. So you have to have your racial consciousness in order for this to even get off the ground. So you've broken liberal society. You've broken the idea that there's a common citizenry. And how redress would work is that you would have ameliorative affirmative action that targets the lower class. You would actually have a society that was actually trying to solve the real problem. So yeah, I mean, that's the other horrible part in all of this is that it gets you to work on a solution which is really more of the same problem, which doesn't solve the underlying cause, which is how do you get poor people uplifted, rather than just serving elites who share the same group identity as those poor people. And so we see for mediocre, pseudo-intellectual reasons that policy that targets based on race, it always helps the wrong people. It doesn't trickle down to the bottom of the targeted group. And this fact is what even makes it toxic, because the elites who do benefit from it know that it doesn't trickle down. And so there has to be a cover ideology. So somehow there has to be a kind of spiritual renaissance that's racialized. And this has poisoned society. Or it's at least poisoned liberal ideology for a generation. Now, I think in the same way, feminism is very similar. You know, like, why is there a gender studies department which is all based in feminism? You know, if they're going to be feminist studies, why isn't there masculinity studies? Why is there a parity of these things? You know, the lack of gatekeeping in the academy that has set up a department which is kind of like a radical political project and has ended up poisoning the whole of the academy in skewing it towards, again, look, I mean, it's the same formula as what I was just talking about. Looking at people based on their group. There was another point that I should make about correlation. But yeah, I think I did go through all of that. The target of the policy is correlated to the intelligence of the policy, which is correlated to the morality of the policy. And if you don't have intelligent policy, it's just going to be ineffectual. But the idea that it's also moral is important. And so we've got a huge sort of groupthink that exists now, a huge bandwagon of immorality within culture, within society. And it's, you know, I wonder if liberalism can resurrect itself. Because it does seem to have a problem with being able to defend itself. Doesn't have a kind of fluid, natural set of adherents. You know, there are no liberal zealots that are very good at I guess in the two cases that I talk about, in this racialism and this feminism that has sort of taken over everything, you know, the solution is non-sexism and non-racialism. Both of which have not been able to assert themselves in a culture that seems to be gynocentric and seems to be female orientated, at least in its outlook, looking out for the interests of women. It's interesting. I've recently had the idea that, I mean, this is quite a naive idea, but anyway, low resolution, that, women will do what they do and men will just kind of tolerate it and try to deliver it. They'll try to do what they're asked, what's asked of them. And that seems to be the general course that society and culture generally takes. That's the kind of conversation, that's the negotiation that's being hashed out. How good are men at delivering a woman's interests to her? Or what she's asking for, what she's demanding. That seems to be what culture is all about. And obviously men have to have the capacity to deliver, otherwise they're not valued in the system of satisfying female desires. That's a bit of perhaps too much of an oversimplification. I mean, you could say that is facilitated by the fact that men compete for things, and they will compete against other men for high value women, and so that creates a kind of choke point. Courtship kind of creates the tone, all the sort of traditions around courtship generate the tone of how culture is mediated. And, at the point at which there was complete legal equality between the sexes, I understand that can be a little bit of a tricky issue, but generally speaking, I would say that there's perhaps even too much freedom and rights granted to women in respect of other people's interests when the legal system is it's interesting because when you take that approach, when women are treated essentially as a kind of, that they need to be looked after by a judge, which is effectively acting as a guardian. There's this, in the end, that creates the symbolically, it represents what women are in culture, in society. And essentially that makes women to be quite dangerous because they don't have to state things and make them above board and have open contracts that are clearly devised for their interests to be protected. Because they have politicians and judges looking out for their interests so that they can keep things vague and nebulous and end up getting the better end of the deal anyway. But this is, maybe that is in a low resolution form what women are. that they do need that extra level of protection, and that, if there is going to be nebulousness, that risk is going to be carried by the people who engage with women. But it is interesting how when feminism got into the academy, everything turned into a kind of grievance studies. When there's an absolute failure of gatekeeping to have standards and to have an orderly academy, in which each department can actually look at its own subject matter without being invaded by gender studies. Hmm. So I do think that the academy is the source of all of this problem. If there was just at least one university that actually kept this stuff out of their curricula, kept this stuff out of their departments, and subscribed to journals and refused to subscribe to other journals based on the quality of the academic work, that then they would at least be a model for other universities to follow and other institutions to get information from a source of information that wasn't polluted by ideological, political grievance that has otherwise been sheltered. But yeah, I mean, the reason why I bring this up is because there's a in all this grievance stuff, the one thing that is shared is this idea about systemic oppression, which is a concept which is an amoral concept. Fundamentally, there is no, if you want to talk about systemic oppression that isn't active but is somehow an inherited impact from history, it's not an ongoing active thing. There's nothing morally that can be done about it except by denying people's autonomy and patronizing people to the extent to which they no longer have any kind of liberal self-ownership, therefore dehumanizing them and treating them according to the framework of this hurt that then defines them. And this hurt that defines them has hurt them to a nebulous extent, an unknown quantity of hurt, because this is all based on whatever group designation they were targeted in the past from. So it is a kind of way to relive out history, but in the reverse, to sort of unwind it by playing it backwards, or at least, I mean, there are some very good arguments, I would say. Let me make them, as to why you can't use this kind of framework of systemic oppression. So first off, if you conflate fixing history with justice, it's a very complicated formula that you're trying to run there, but I mean, that's something that you're trying to do in your imagination. You're trying to create a counterfactual, what would have been if not for. Now, this counterfactual means that you're owed what? You're owed what you can imagine is in the counterfactual. And this is only ever going to apply to you via a generalization of your group. So you've got some kind of lowest common denominator in there that you're trying to get a dividend from. Like, now I would say that if you want to make that kind of argument, you actually have to ask for something tangible. You actually have to say, this is what is required. And it can't be an endless list. It has to be something like, if that's going to be your kind of argument, then you actually have to state what it is that you're after. I want, this would be the solution. This would bring about the break-even point. And it can't be some open-ended process. It has to be, this must be handed over, this amount of money, this or that policy for this long. It actually has to be a prescription that actually has to, from the outset, run a particular course. If you can't make a prescription that is definitive, then, and obviously no one who uses that kind of argument does make definitive prescriptions, because, I mean, essentially they'll say, well, reparations are owed, but reparations don't help. They're sort of, there's the solution that are part of the toxic problem somehow, thinking that it can ever be paid off. So you're really just dealing with someone's historical gripe, because they've got a kind of toxic imagination here that they want to take the rest of the culture and society to task for ad infinitum. So yeah, I would say that that's the first thing, is that if you're going to make a systemic oppression argument, you actually have to ask for something tangible, or shut the fuck up. You actually have to make a very tangible, reasonable, something that's actually going to solve the problem. Now, what would actually solve the problem is not targeting based on race. It would be targeting the poor and knowing how to uplift them. That would be the thing that would be the good thing for society. Something that would be pro-social overall. Something that would fix all the problems. Is actually if we knew how to lift people up and empower them. But that never becomes part of the conversation or part of the problem, because it's completely overridden by this disgusting, unintelligent narrative. And so we're held hostage by people who are effectively haunted by historic racism and sexism, which they have to say, oh, no, we're not just being haunted by it, it's still around, it still exists. It never went away. And I mean, obviously that's a very powerful sympathy sucking, destructive model and psychology to take, because it also puts the political into a form which is fundamentally immoral. It puts democracy, it puts, I mean, I would say that the biggest problem that any of this has ever faced is the judiciary, where you've got judges who, too many judges, especially constitutional court judges, have just exceeded, have given up and given into this disgusting form of racialism in the name of sympathy for their racial group. completely forgetting morality, completely betraying the Constitution. But again, this has been, in a soft way, it's been supported by the academy, lending it kind of intellectual credentials that it doesn't deserve. But I guess that's what happens in culture when you get a kind of toxic elite that takes over. This is, in my view, I mean, this is the great polemic of my time and of my generation. And it's sad that people have not taken it. I mean, the people. I mean, a perfect poster child of this, I would say, is there's someone called Penuel, the Black Pen, he calls himself, who is, he's just such a brat. He toys with non-racialism. He, he's very sympathetic. He says disgusting things half the time, like, we never asked for democracy. Like, this country never asked for democracy. I mean, like, well, then what the fuck do you want? It's just such a bratty thing to say. That's the level of intellectualism we have with black elites in this country. It's just a kind of juvenile, racialistic, unintelligent, weird set of patronage that has to be given to a corrupt ideology. And under the weight of that, you just get, basically very mediocre, intellectually unchallenging. You get a status quo that is so toxic and that can't make any headway. Held back in a kind of arrested development. And I wish people like Sihle Ungubese, I hope I'm saying his surname correctly, Big Daddy Liberty, I wish he would go and argue with Penuel, the Black Pen. That's the level of argument which people don't take the fight to these black elite imposters, essentially, or that they're sympathetic with black elite imposters, because they have to they can't acknowledge how an element of the black elite are imposters because of affirmative action, and because that can't be acknowledged, you have to sort of paper over all this immorality. You have to be very angry that the poor aren't being served, but being very indifferent about your own benefit, about the benefits that have accrued to you because of your color. And I mean, and I think that you see this especially in the pressure that it's put on legal sources of judgment and power to open up racism, to have, like that, in the Supreme Court in America that just had this landmark ruling against affirmative action, there was one judgment that was for the affirmative action still. That's what that judgment that is for affirmative action is pretty much how the Constitutional Court in my country has been corrupted by that blithe and openly ignorant, pretending kind of philosophy. It really is the ideology of an imposter. So I don't know what I'm going to title this recording yet. I have Black Elite Imposters and Their Revenge on Meritocracy. But Black Elite Imposter Ideology, can I call it that? And its homicide of liberalism, the death of liberalism. Maybe that should be what I call it.